Baroness Adelaide ripped her father's last will to shreds. The sound was sharp, like a dry bone snapping in the quiet of the parlor. She didn't hesitate. She didn't pray. She simply watched the heavy parchment flutter into the fireplace where the orange flames licked the edges, turning 20 years of a man's promised freedom into grey ash. Then she turned toward the doorway where Elias stood. He was 45 years old, his skin the color of deep mahogany, and his hands calloused from 2 decades of shaping iron in the plantation's forge. He had seen it all. He had seen the old Baron sign that paper. He had seen the promise written in ink. But in the eyes of the daughter, that ink was just a stain to be bleached away. Adelaide reached into her silk reticule, pulled out a single copper penny, and tossed it at his feet. It hit the floorboards with a dull thud and rolled into the dirt near the threshold. She told him that was his final wage. She told him he was nothing more than property to be sold downriver by morning. She thought she had buried his future. What she didn't know was that she had just handed him the only key that could tear her world apart. The air in Louisiana that summer was a wet blanket, thick with the smell of rotting jasmine and wood smoke. Oakwood Plantation looked like a palace from the road, with its white columns and manicured lawns, but inside it was a house of cards. The old Baron had been dead for only 3 days, and already the smell of desperation was stronger than the scent of the funeral lilies. Adelaide was 30 years old, sharp-featured and drowning. She had spent her youth in New Orleans and Paris, running up bills that the plantation's sugar crops could no longer cover. She needed money, and she needed it fast. To her, the people working the fields weren't humans with histories. They were line items on a ledger. Elias was the most valuable item she had. He was a master blacksmith. He could fix anything from a broken plow to the intricate iron gates of the city's wealthiest estates. He was worth a fortune on the auction block. The only problem was her father's will, which clearly stated that upon his death, Elias was to be given his manumission papers and a small plot of land on the edge of the property. Notice how some people call this the way of the world, but it's just plain robbery with a fancy name. Adelaide didn't care about the law of the land. She only cared about the law of her own pocketbook. She had spent the last 48 hours scouring her father's desk, looking for any loophole. When she found none, she chose the simplest solution: destruction. She called Elias to the main house under the guise of discussing his transition to freedom. Instead, she staged a performance of cruelty. She stood by the fireplace, the heat reddening her pale cheeks, and told him that her father had been confused in his final days. She claimed the will Elias thought he saw was a forgery. Then she pulled the real one, the one that actually bore the Baron's seal, and fed it to the fire right in front of him. Elias stood perfectly still. He didn't beg. He didn't shout. He watched the signature of the man he had served faithfully turn into a black curl of smoke. Adelaide laughed then. It was a high, brittle sound. She told him she was calling the slave traders from the city. They would be there by dawn to take him to the pens. To add one final layer of humiliation, she threw that penny. She told him it was more than he was worth, but she felt generous. Elias looked down at the coin. Most men would have left it there. Most men would have been blinded by the rage of losing their life's hope in a single afternoon. But Elias was a man of details. You don't work iron for 20 years without learning how to spot the smallest flaw, the tiniest crack, or the unique mark of a maker. He knelt down slowly, his knees popping, and picked the copper coin out of the dust. He felt the weight of it. It was heavier than a common penny. He felt the edge. It wasn't smooth. It had lettering engraved so fine you'd need a jeweler's glass to read it. The Baroness watched him, her lip curling in disgust. She thought he was groveling for a single cent. She turned her back on him to pour a glass of sherry, dismissing him as if he were a stray dog. Elias slipped the coin into the hidden pocket of his leather apron. He knew exactly what that coin was. He had seen it once before, years ago, when the old Baron was in a state of rare, drunken honesty. The Baron had shown him a small, gleaming copper piece, a 1792 birch cent. It was one of the first coins ever struck by the United States Mint, a gift from a founding father to the Baron's own father. But it wasn't just a collector's item. The Baron had told Elias that as long as that coin stayed on the property, the true heart of Oakwood would never be lost. At the time, Elias thought it was just the ramblings of an old man. Now, feeling the specific ridges of the coin against his thumb, he realized the Baron hadn't been talking about luck. He had been talking about a mechanism. Elias walked back to the forge, his mind racing faster than the bellows of his furnace. He knew the plantation was in debt, but he also knew the old Baron was a paranoid man. He didn't trust banks. He didn't trust the government. He had hidden a secondary deed to the land and a cache of gold somewhere on the grounds, a reserve that even Adelaide didn't know existed. She was tearing the house apart, looking for a safe behind paintings or floorboards under the rugs. But she was looking in the world of women and soft things. She never thought to look in the world of fire and iron. Elias entered the forge, the familiar smell of coal and hot metal greeting him. He looked at his anvil. It was a massive 300-pound block of iron that had sat in the center of the room for 40 years. It had belonged to the Baron's father before him. If you're the kind of person who wants to see the truth dragged out of the shadows, subscribe to this channel. Tell me, was that penny a final insult or the start of her funeral? Elias ran his hand over the side of the anvil. He had cleaned it every day for 2 decades. He knew every scratch and every dent, but now he looked at the base. There was a small circular indentation, no bigger than a finger's tip, hidden under a layer of accumulated grease and soot. He took a rag and wiped it clean. The hole was the exact diameter of the birch scent. He looked toward the main house. The lights were flickering in the parlor. Adelaide was probably celebrating her shrewd business move. She had already sent a messenger to the city. The traders would be coming with chains and wagons. Elias had less than 12 hours to prove he wasn't a piece of property, but the rightful heir to the promise the Baron had made him. He heard a soft footfall at the door. It was Silas, the aging stable hand. Silas's eyes were wide and watery. He had been peeking through the parlor window when Adelaide burned the will. He saw the whole thing. He told Elias that he had managed to reach into the cold ashes after Adelaide left the room and snatched a small charred corner of the parchment that hadn't fully burned. It wasn't much, just a fragment with the Baron's initials and the word freedom barely legible, but it was something. Elias shook his head. "It won't be enough, Silas," he whispered. "The judge is a man of paper and gold. He won't take a burnt scrap against the word of a Baroness. We need the real deed. We need the proof she can't burn." Elias showed Silas the penny. He explained what he thought the anvil held, but there was a new problem. Adelaide wasn't just greedy, she was suspicious. She knew Elias was smarter than the average man. She knew he had been close to her father. As Elias and Silas spoke in the shadows of the forge, they saw the glow of a lantern approaching. It was Adelaide's personal carriage driver, a man named Holloway, who did her dirty work. She had sent him to search Elias's quarters. She wanted to make sure he hadn't stolen any silver or jewelry before the traders arrived. If they found that coin, it would be gone forever. Elias didn't have time to test the anvil. He had to hide the coin, but not on himself. He pressed the rare cent into Silas's hand. "Get this to Caleb," Elias hissed. Caleb was the young messenger boy who ran errands between the plantations. "Tell him to take it to Judge Beaumont in the morning. Tell him it's a gift from the Baron's estate for his collection. The judge won't be able to resist seeing it in person." Silas vanished into the darkness just as Holloway kicked open the door of the forge. The driver was a big man with a cruel streak. He started tossing tools, knocking over bins of coal and sneering at Elias. He searched Elias's pockets, his boots, and even made him open his mouth. He found nothing. He spat on the floor and told Elias to enjoy his last night of sleep, because the long walk started at sunrise. Elias just watched him. He didn't say a word. He was thinking about the anvil. He was thinking about the weight of the coin. He was wondering if the judge, a man known for his love of rare antiquities, would recognize the birch scent for what it was, or if he would just see it as another piece of copper. The night dragged on. Every sound, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of the cane stalks, sounded like the approach of the slave trader's wagon. Elias sat in the dark forge, his hammer resting across his knees. He wasn't planning on fighting his way out with iron. He was playing a deeper game. He knew Adelaide's weakness, her arrogance. She thought she was the smartest person in the room because she had a title and a dress made of silk. She didn't realize that the man she had insulted with a penny was the one who held the key to her father's most guarded secret. She had handed him the weapon herself, blinded by the desire to see him crawl. By the time the sun started to peek over the horizon, the sound of carriage wheels finally echoed down the long oak-lined driveway. But it wasn't just one carriage. There were two. One was the heavy, barred wagon of the traders. The other was a black polished brougham with the seal of the local circuit court. Judge Beaumont had arrived earlier than expected. The game was about to begin, and Elias knew that if he missed a single beat, he wouldn't just lose his freedom, he would lose his life. The sun rose over the Louisiana swamps like a bruised eye, red and swollen against the horizon. At Oakwood Plantation, the morning didn't bring the smell of breakfast or the sound of the morning bell. It brought the rhythmic clinking of heavy iron chains. The slave traders had arrived. They were two men with skin like cured leather and eyes that had seen too much misery to feel any more of it. They parked their barred wagon right in front of the main house, a deliberate insult to the elegance of the white columns. Adelaide stood on the porch, her silk dress rustling as she fanned herself against the mounting humidity. She looked down at Elias, who was being led from the forge by Holloway. She didn't see a man who had built the very gates she lived behind. She saw a check that was about to clear. She saw her debts vanishing into the dust behind a departing wagon. But what she didn't see was the black brougham carriage pulling up right behind the traders. Judge Beaumont stepped out of his carriage before the dust had even settled. He was a man made of stiff collars and cold logic. He didn't look at the traders, and he barely looked at Adelaide. He was looking at a ledger in his hand. You see, in those days, a baron's death wasn't just a family tragedy. It was a feast for the creditors. Adelaide had spent months pretending the estate was solvent, but the judge knew better. He was there to begin the official audit of the Oakwood assets. Look at this. The law back then had two weights but only one measure, and it always favored the one with the name on the front door, at least until that name started bouncing checks in New Orleans. Adelaide's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her fingers tightening on the handle of her fan until the wood creaked. She hadn't expected the judge until noon. She needed Elias gone before the audit began, because Elias knew where the silver was hidden, and more importantly, he knew about the papers she had fed to the fire. The traders moved toward Elias with a set of iron shackles. The air was so thick you could almost taste the salt and the stagnant water from the nearby bayou. Elias stood tall, his eyes fixed on the forge, not on the chains. He was waiting for a sign. He was waiting to see if Caleb had made it. The judge approached the porch, his boots thumping on the wood with a sound like a gavel hitting a block. He greeted Adelaide with a nod that was more a formality than a sign of respect. He told her that before any property could be sold or moved off the plantation, a full inventory had to be verified. The creditors had filed an injunction. Everything, from the livestock to the people in the fields, was frozen in place by the court. Adelaide's face went from pale to a ghostly white. She tried to argue, claiming the sale of Elias was already finalized, but the judge didn't even look up from his papers. He told the traders to wait. Inside the forge, the fire had gone out, but the anvil was still warm. That heavy block of iron sat there like a silent witness. Elias felt a surge of cold adrenaline. He was still in danger, but the clock had slowed down. Adelaide realized she was losing control of the narrative. She stepped down from the porch, her voice high and sharp, accusing Elias of stealing a precious family heirloom. She told the judge that Elias was a thief and that she was only trying to rid the estate of a criminal before he did more damage. It was a desperate move. She was trying to discredit him before he could speak a single word. She claimed he had stolen a rare copper coin from her father's desk, the very penny she had tossed in the mud the day before. The irony was as thick as the soot on Elias's face. She had realized far too late that the trash she threw away was actually a piece of the Baron's secret fortune. She remembered her father telling her once that a single copper cent would buy the plantation 10 times over if the banks ever came calling. She had thought it was a riddle of a dying man. Now, seeing the judge's interest piqued by the mention of a rare coin, she tried to claim it as her own. She demanded that Holloway search Elias again, right there in front of the judge. She wanted that coin back. She needed it to pay off the men in New Orleans who were threatening to take her furniture and her fine clothes. If you don't swallow this kind of well-dressed lie, subscribe. This channel is where we pull the truth out of the dirt they tried to bury it in. And tell me, do you think Adelaide truly believed she could win? Or was she just running on pure, blind panic? Holloway stepped forward, his heavy hands rough as he tore at Elias's shirt and felt along the waistband of his trousers. He found nothing. He went to the forge and started kicking over the water buckets and throwing the tongs across the room. He was looking for a glint of copper, but all he found was shadows and dust. Elias didn't move. He didn't flinch. He knew the coin was miles away by now, tucked into the pocket of a young boy who knew the back trails through the swamp, better than any grown man. But then, the situation took a turn that made Elias's blood run cold. One of the judge's assistants, a young man with sharp eyes, walked up from the stables holding something in a pair of tweezers. It wasn't the coin. It was the charred fragment of the will that Silas had tried to save. The assistant had found it caught in a cobweb near the fireplace vent, where the draft had carried it. He handed it to the judge. Adelaide's breath hitched. She watched as the judge adjusted his spectacles and peered at the blackened scrap of paper. He could see the Baron's distinctive flourish. He could see the word free. The silence that followed was heavier than the anvil in the forge. The judge looked at Adelaide, then at Elias, then back at the paper. Adelaide didn't skip a beat. She claimed the paper was a draft of a letter her father had written to a friend, nothing more. She said Elias must have planted it there to frame her. She was a master of the pivot, turning every piece of evidence into a weapon against the man who had no voice in the eyes of the law. But the judge was a collector of facts as much as he was a collector of coins. He asked Elias if he had anything to say. This was the moment. The traders were watching, their hands on their hips, annoyed by the delay. Adelaide was glaring, a silent threat in her eyes that promised a slow death if he spoke. Elias took a step forward. He didn't talk about the will. He didn't talk about the fire. He spoke about the anvil. He told the judge that the Baron had a special way of keeping his most important records. He said the Baron had always told him that the truth was forged in fire and kept in iron. Adelaide laughed, calling it the superstitious babbling of a blacksmith. But the judge was intrigued. He knew the old Baron had been an eccentric man, a man who built secret compartments into his snuff boxes and hidden drawers into his desks. The mention of the anvil struck a chord. He walked toward the forge, his silk coat-tails brushing against the blackened coal on the floor. He stood before the anvil and looked at it as if he were seeing it for the first time. Just as the judge reached out to touch the iron, a horse came galloping up the driveway. The rider was covered in mud, his animal lathered in white foam. It was Caleb, but he wasn't alone. He was being chased by one of Adelaide's overseers on a faster horse. The overseer caught up to the boy right in front of the forge, grabbing him by the collar and yanking him off the pony. Caleb hit the ground hard, and as he fell, something bright and copper-colored tumbled out of his hand and rolled across the dirt. It stopped right at the judge's feet. Adelaide lunged for it, her fingers clawing at the air, but the judge was faster. He stooped down and picked up the coin. He held it up to the light. The 1792 birch cent. The copper glowed with a dull, ancient luster. The judge's eyes widened. He knew exactly what he was holding. He knew the history of the coin, the rarity of it, and the immense value it represented. But he also knew something else. He looked at the edge of the coin, seeing the tiny, microscopic engravings. Then he looked at the anvil. He saw the small, circular indentation that Elias had cleaned earlier. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to click into place, but the picture they were forming was one that Adelaide was prepared to kill to keep hidden. She signaled to Holloway and the overseer. They stepped between the judge and the forge, their hands moving toward the pistols tucked into their belts. The tension in the yard was a physical weight. The traders, sensing a different kind of trouble, started to back away toward their wagon. They were in the business of buying people, not getting caught in the middle of a shootout with a circuit court judge. Adelaide stood behind her men, her face twisted into a mask of pure malice. She told the judge that the coin was stolen property, and she wanted it back immediately. She told him that whatever fairy tale Elias had spun about the anvil was a lie designed to stall for time. She gave the judge a choice, Give her the coin and let the traders take the blacksmith, or face the consequences of interfering with the private business of a sovereign plantation. The judge didn't flinch. He looked at the birch scent, then he looked at the charred scrap of the will in his other hand. He realized he wasn't just looking at an audit anymore. He was looking at a crime scene. He looked at Elias, who stood like a statue in the center of the storm. Elias knew that if the judge backed down now, he would be on that wagon within minutes, and he would never be seen again. The secret of the anvil would die with him, and Adelaide would use the coin to buy her way out of her sins. The judge took a deep breath, the humidity rattling in his chest. He looked Adelaide straight in the eye and said that the court would be taking physical custody of the anvil for further examination. That was the breaking point. Adelaide screamed an order, and for a second it looked like the dirt of Oakwood was about to be stained with more than just sweat. The standoff in the yard was a powder keg, and the fuse was already burning. Adelaide's threat hung in the thick, humid air, like the smell of ozone before a lightning strike. Halloway and the overseer didn't move their hands from their belts, their eyes fixed on the judge, waiting for the signal to turn the plantation into a graveyard. But Judge Beaumont was a man who had spent his life staring down criminals and debtors from a high bench. He didn't blink. He held that birch scent between his thumb and forefinger, the copper glinting like an ember. He told Adelaide, in a voice as cold as a mountain stream, that any act of violence against an officer of the court would be met with the full weight of the state militia. He wasn't just a judge. He was the law's physical presence on that dirt, and for a moment, the sheer weight of his authority made the armed men hesitate. The silence that followed was broken only by the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the horses and the distant, mocking call of a crow in the cypress trees. Adelaide was vibrating with a rage that bordered on madness. She knew the walls were closing in. Her father had always been a man of secrets, a man who built his empire on foundations of iron and silence, and she had spent her whole life trying to pry those secrets out of him. Now a man she considered little more than a tool was handing the master key to the very person who could strip her of everything. She looked at Elias, and for the first time there was a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. It wasn't just that he knew about the coin, it was that he knew her. He had seen her desperation. He had seen the way she tore that will, and he hadn't blinked. He had outplayed her with a single penny. The judge turned his back on the armed men, a move of calculated defiance, and walked into the forge. The temperature inside was 10 degrees hotter than the yard, the air smelling of old soot, quenched iron, and the metallic tang of the anvil. Elias followed him, his shadow long and jagged across the dirt floor. The judge stood before the anvil, the massive block of iron that had been the heartbeat of Oakwood for 40 years. He looked at the small circular indentation at the base, then at the coin in his hand. He hesitated. He was a man who valued the tangible, the proven and the historical, but even he felt the strange weight of the moment. If the coin didn't fit, or if the mechanism was jammed by decades of rust, Elias was a dead man, and the truth would stay buried under the soot. If you don't engold this type of well-dressed lie, subscribe. This channel is where we pull the truth out of the dirt they tried to bury it in. Han, tell me, this coin, this birch scent, was it a gift to Elias or a sentence for Adelaide? The judge stepped closer, his fingers trembling slightly as he aligned the rare scent with the hole in the iron. Adelaide stood at the entrance of the forge, the light from the yard silhouetting her like a ghost. She was whispering to Halloway, her voice a low, urgent hiss. She was telling him to get ready. She was planning to grab the contents of the anvil and burn them before the judge could even read a word. She didn't care about the law anymore. She was fighting for survival. Elias watched the judge's hand. He remembered the sound the old Baron used to make when he was working on a delicate piece of clockwork, a soft, focused grunt. He saw the judge press the coin into the indentation. At first, nothing happened. The coin sat there, a perfect fit, but the iron remained silent. Adelaide let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound of triumph that cut through the heat. She started to move forward, claiming the trick had failed. But then, Elias reached out. He didn't ask permission. He picked up his heaviest rounding hammer from the bench. With one swift, controlled motion, he struck the top of the anvil directly over the center of the horn. The sound was a deafening ping that echoed off the rafters, and sent the birds screaming from the trees outside. It wasn't the dull thud of a normal strike. It was a harmonic vibration that shook the very floorboards. Inside the base of the anvil, a heavy spring, coiled under immense pressure for years, finally snapped into action. There was a series of mechanical clicks, the sound of precision-engineered tumblers falling into place. A small square panel on the side of the anvil, so perfectly fitted that the seam was invisible to the naked eye, popped open about half an inch. The judge gasped, his hand flying to his mouth. Adelaide froze, her face turning a shade of grey that matched the ash in the fireplace. The judge pulled the panel open. It wasn't a large space, but it was lined with oiled silk to protect the contents from the damp Louisiana air. He reached in and pulled out a bundle of papers tied with a faded blue ribbon. Next to the papers was a small leather pouch. When the judge opened the pouch, the sound of heavy metal clinking filled the room. Gold. Double eagles, minted in the 1840s, untouched and shimmering in the dim light of the forge. This was the Baron's heart of Oakwood. It was enough gold to pay off every debt Adelaide had accrued in the gambling dens of New Orleans and still leave a fortune behind. But the gold wasn't the most important thing in that hidden drawer. The judge untied the blue ribbon. His hands were steady now, the adrenaline of discovery giving him a renewed focus. He spread the papers out on the flat surface of the anvil. The first document was the original secondary deed to the plantation, a copy that couldn't be disputed, filed with the Federal Land Office years ago, but kept here as the ultimate insurance. The second document was a long handwritten letter from the Baron. As the judge read the first few lines, his eyes darted toward Adelaide, then back to the page. His expression shifted from curiosity to a deep, simmering indignation. He didn't say a word. He just kept reading, his lips thinning into a hard line. Adelaide couldn't take the silence. She demanded to know what was in the letter. She tried to snatch it, but the judge pulled it away, his voice booming as he ordered her to stay back. He looked at her not as a noblewoman, but as a defendant. He told her that the letter was a full confession from her father. The old Baron had been a man of many sins, but in his final years the guilt of his choices had started to eat him alive. He had written the truth about his daughter. He had written about the debt he owed to a woman in the city, a woman who wasn't Adelaide's mother. He had written about how Adelaide was actually the daughter of a business partner who had died in a fire, a child the Baron had taken in and raised as his own to secure a massive inheritance from the girl's true grandfather. But the real bomb, the one that leveled the House of Oakwood, was the third document. It was a birth record and a deed of manumission for a woman named Sarah, who had died years ago. And next to it was a document that proved Elias wasn't just a blacksmith. He was the Baron's biological son. The Baron had been too cowardly to acknowledge him in life, too afraid of the social scandal that would follow, but he had left the truth in the iron. He had left the plantation to Elias, naming him the sole heir to the land and the gold, provided the test of the coin was ever passed. Adelaide was an impostor, a legal phantom who had been living on a lie that her father had finally decided to expose from beyond the grave. The room felt like it was spinning. Elias leaned against the forge, the heat of the fire he had tended for 20 years finally making sense. He looked at the papers, at the gold, and at the woman who had just tried to sell him like a piece of livestock. She wasn't the mistress of Oakwood. She was a fraud. Adelaide's mind was racing, trying to find a way out, a way to spin this. She started to scream that the papers were forgeries, that Elias had made them in the forge. She was hysterical, her hair falling out of its neat pins, her expensive dress stained with soot. She turned to Holloway, ordered him to kill everyone in the room and take the gold. She was willing to burn the whole world down just to keep a title that never belonged to her. Holloway looked at the gold. He looked at the judge. He looked at the traders, who were now standing at the door of the forge, their eyes wide at the sight of the treasure. The dynamic of the room had shifted completely. Money like that changed loyalties faster than a summer storm. Holloway wasn't a man of loyalty. He was a man of profit. He looked at Adelaide, then at the judge. He slowly took his hand off his pistol. He wasn't going to die for a woman who was no longer the boss. He wasn't going to go to the gallows for a fraud. He stepped back, a cold smirk on his face, leaving Adelaide standing alone in the center of the forge, her power evaporating like steam on a hot iron. The judge carefully gathered the papers. He told Elias that while the law was complicated, the evidence in his hand was overwhelming. He told Adelaide that she was under arrest for the destruction of a legal will, fraud, and the attempted illegal sale of a free man. The traders, realizing there was no profit to be had here, and only trouble with the law, turned their wagon around and started to head back down the driveway, the empty chains rattling against the wood. Adelaide watched them go, her last hope of getting rid of Elias vanishing into the dust. She sank to her knees on the soot-covered floor, the silk of her dress absorbing the grime of the forge she had despised for so long. Elias looked at the birch scent, which was still sitting in the indentation of the anvil. He reached out and picked it up. It was just a piece of copper, but it was the only thing in his life that had ever told the truth. He looked at the judge and asked what happened next. The judge told him that the court would have to verify the documents in the city, but for now the forge and the house were under his protection. The transition of power was starting, but the scars of 20 years of servitude weren't going to vanish overnight. Elias wasn't thinking about the gold or the land. He was thinking about the man who had been his father, and yet had let him work in the heat and the smoke for 2 decades before giving him the key to his own life. It was a cold kind of justice, the kind that left a bitter taste in the back of your throat. Adelaide tried to buy silence with a copper coin, but she ended up paying for her crimes with every acre of land she had tried to steal. The truth was out, and the woman who called herself a baroness was nothing more than a common fraud, standing in the dirt of a blacksmith's forge. Judge Beaumont didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with the cold, clinical detachment of a man who had seen too many well-dressed people do ugly things. He held the documents tightly, his knuckles white against the dark leather of his gloves. He told the sheriff's deputies to take her. The sound of the iron shackles clicking shut around Adelaide's delicate wrists was the only answer to her screams. It was the same sound she had planned for Elias, a sharp metallic finality that stripped her of her name and her silk-lined world. Repara nisso. Tem gente que chama isso de costume, mas é crueldade com nome e sobrenome. Adelaide didn't just want the money. She wanted to erase the very existence of the man who stood as a living reminder of her father's secrets. But you can't erase iron, and you can't burn the truth when it's hidden in the heart of a 300-pound anvil. The deputies dragged her toward the waiting wagon, the very same wagon the slave traders had brought for Elias. She fought them every step of the way, her heels digging grooves into the dust, her voice cracking as she called for Halloway to save her. But Halloway was already gone. He had seen the way the wind was blowing and had disappeared into the tall cane fields before the first pair of handcuffs could be produced. He was a rat, and rats always know when the ship is under water. The yard was filled with the people who had worked that land for decades. They stood in a wide circle, silent and watchful. They saw the woman who had whipped them for a misplaced word being shoved into the back of a barred cage. There was no cheering. There was only a heavy, solemn realization that the world had just shifted on its axis. The judge turned to Elias. He looked at the man's calloused hands, the soot on his brow, and the quiet dignity in his eyes. He told Elias that the law would take time to process the deeds, but as of that moment he was a free man, not because of a favor, not because of a gift, but because it was his right. The gold found in the anvil was more than enough to cover the estate's debts and leave a massive inheritance. Elias wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was the wealthiest man in the parish. Elias didn't look at the gold. He looked at the anvil. He reached out and touched the cool, dark metal. He thought about the 20 years he had spent hammering out plows and shoeing horses, never knowing that the floor beneath his feet was legally his. He thought about the old Baron, a man who had been too weak to tell the truth while his heart was still beating, but too afraid of the afterlife to take the secret to his grave. It was a cowardly kind of justice, the kind that forces a son to earn his father's recognition in sweat and blood. Elias picked up the 1792 birch scent from the workbench where the judge had left it. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the weight of the copper. It was the price of a life, the key to a kingdom, and a final insult all rolled into one. Se você não engole esse tipo de mentira bem vestida, se inscreve. E me diz, essa prova, the birch scent, era aviso ou sentença? Elias knew that staying at Oakwood was impossible. The house was a monument to a lie, and the land was soaked in too much pain to ever feel like home. He didn't want to be the new master of a plantation built on the backs of people he called brothers. He told the judge that he wanted the estate sold. He wanted the land divided and offered to the people who had worked it, and the rest of the gold used to build a new life far away from the swamps of Louisiana. The judge was surprised, but he nodded. He was a man of the law, but even he could see the wisdom in leaving a graveyard behind. The next few days were a blur of lawyers and ledgers. Adelaide was held in the parish jail, waiting for a trial that everyone knew she would lose. The creditors circled like vultures, but the gold from the anvil kept them at bay. Elias spent his last nights in the forge, not working but just sitting in the quiet. He gave Silas a pouch of gold coins, enough to buy a house and never have to touch a horse's bridle again. He gave Caleb the pony he had ridden into the yard and a scholarship to a school in the north. He was stripping the plantation of its worth, but he was doing it to give worth back to the people who had been denied it for so long. On the morning Elias was set to leave, the sun was bright and the air was clear for the first time in weeks. He dressed in a suit of dark wool, his hands clean of soot but still scarred by the heat of the fire. He walked up to the main house one last time. He stood in the parlor where Adelaide had burned the will. The fireplace was cold now, filled with nothing but grey ash. He looked at the white columns and the expensive furniture, and he realized he felt nothing for it. It was just wood and stone. He walked back down the steps and out to the gate. He didn't have a trunk or a carriage filled with silk. He had a small bag of clothes, a letter of manumission signed by the highest court in the state, and a single copper penny in his pocket. The sheriff arrived to take Adelaide to the city for the formal hearing. She was wearing the same dress she had been arrested in, but it was torn and filthy now. She saw Elias standing by the gate. She stopped and looked at him, her eyes burning with a hollow, useless hatred. She tried to speak, but her voice was gone. Elias didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, seeing the woman who thought a penny was all he was worth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a different coin, a common, worthless penny he had found in the dirt. He tossed it at her feet, just like she had done to him. He leaned in and spoke the only words he would ever say to her again. "You gave me the price of your father's soul, mistress, and it only cost you a penny." Adelaide was led away, her head bowed as the wagon pulled out of the driveway. Elias watched the dust settle. He turned toward the road that led to the river. He was 45 years old, and for the first time in his life, the road didn't have a fence on either side. He thought about the forge and the anvil. He had left the birch scent inside the mechanism, locked away again, but this time with a different purpose. He had left instructions that the anvil was to be donated to the city museum, a permanent reminder that the truth can be forged into the hardest iron and it will still find a way to break free. He didn't need the coin anymore. He had the freedom it had bought him, and that was a weight he was finally happy to carry. The story of the Oakwood penny became a legend in that part of the state. People talked about the blacksmith who became a king and the Baroness who became a beggar. They talked about the anvil that could only be opened by a specific piece of copper. But for Elias, it wasn't a legend. It was the reality of a world that tried to crush him and failed. He moved to Philadelphia, started a business, and lived a long, quiet life. He never worked iron again, but he always kept a small piece of copper on his desk. Not the rare one, just a regular penny. He liked to look at it and remember that the smallest thing in the world can be the very thing that brings a palace crashing down. Greed blinds the eye to the smallest details. Adelaide thought she was throwing away trash, but she was handing over the keys to her own prison. She forgot that the people she looked down on were the ones who built the world she lived in. They knew the secrets of the house, because they were the ones who fixed the leaks and paved the roads. They knew the weight of the truth because they were the ones who had to carry it. In the end, the plantation was gone, the name was disgraced, and the only thing left of the Baron's legacy was a story about a coin and a son who refused to stay in the shadows. Se inscreve. Aqui a gente puxa o que tentaram enterrar. E comenta: você acha que o barão foi justo no fim, ou ele só foi covarde que deixou a bagunça para o filho arrumar? Justice is a slow-moving river, but it always reaches the sea. Adelaide learned that the hard way. She thought her father's signature was the only thing that mattered, but she forgot that a man's word is only as good as the iron he leaves behind. Elias walked away from the smoke and the fire, and he never looked back. He knew that the only thing more valuable than a rare gold coin is the ability to walk down a road and know that your shadow belongs to you and nobody else.